I've always imagined that naming a favorite food is a little bit like naming a favorite child. You know, you say to your friends like, hey, oysters are my favorite food. And then every time you see them, they bring you oysters. And of course you feel like you have to eat them. And you eat so many of them, you get kind of sick of them. It just doesn't seem good. Is that like naming a favorite child? If you frequent oyster bars, you'd be forgiven for assuming that there are hundreds of species of oysters in the world. Oyster menus offer a ton of variety, and each oyster seems to taste so different than the one you just slurped. But the truth is, only 5 oyster species are actually cultivated in North America, and only a couple more are farmed worldwide. The 5 types are Eastern, Pacific, Kumamoto, European Flat, and Olympia. And they have distinct characteristics. For instance, the Eastern oyster features a large, smooth, deep cup, flat lid, teardrop shape, and are deeply savory and briny. This is the oyster that I grew up eating here in the Northeast. They are native to the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico. Pacific oysters are native to Japan, but are the predominant farmed oyster on the West Coast. They feature these gorgeous ruffled shells, and they generally trade more on creaminess and sweetness. The Kumamoto, which also hails from Japan and is extensively farmed on the West Coast, features a small, deep cup and a similar pretty edge to Pacifics. Kumamotos are often sweeter and milder than Pacifics and feature cucumber and melon-like flavors. These are a super popular oyster, even for folks that a lot of times don't think they like oysters. The European Flat, also known as the Boulogne oyster, is potentially the polar opposite of a Kumamoto, in that they can be very large like this specimen here, and are often considered to have one of the more challenging flavor profiles. These guys are distinctly metallic, with tasting notes often referencing copper. Olympias are the Pacific Coast native beauty. They are the smallest species native to North America, but often pack more savoriness and intensity of flavor than either Pacifics or Kumamotos. These fellas are actually pretty hard to find outside of the Pacific Northwest, where only a few farmers really cultivate them. So if there aren't that many species, what accounts for all this variety? I mean, I can sit down at an oyster bar and try 2 different oysters from the same river in Maine, and they taste completely different from one another. What gives? That kind of difference is thanks to the fact that oysters consume whatever is in the water around them, including algae, phytoplankton, and small amounts of plant matter, and that can vary significantly by location. The ocean's impact on an oyster's flavor is called merroir, which is a combination of the French words mer, which means sea, and terroir, a wine industry term that refers to the impact that soil and climate of a vineyard has on a wine's flavor. One big component of merroir, not surprisingly, is salinity. If an oyster grows up in saltier water, its liquor, that liquid that surrounds the oyster in its shell, is going to be saltier. If an oyster comes from brackish waters, it will be less salty. But the impact of salt goes even further. Oysters respond to changing salt levels by actively changing the amount of amino acids and other flavorful compounds in their bodies. So their flavor can actually change dramatically season to season and even tide to tide. Have you ever heard the adage that you should only eat oysters in months that contain the letter R? Let's dig in on that. First, for the monthly challenged amongst us, let's break out the months that actually contain an R. That would be January, February, March, April, September, October, November, and December. So we've got winter, early spring, and fall covered. What's missing? May, June, July, and August, the warm ones. So does that mean that eating oysters in the middle of the summer is dangerous? Should we avoid it at all costs? It does not. This is all about quality and taste. And as rules go, this isn't really one of those hard and fast ones. According to oyster expert Rowan Jacobson, oysters essentially hibernate when the water gets really cold, and they have to live off whatever resources they have until early spring. In preparation for that, they fatten themselves up just like a bear. So oysters in late fall through midwinter are plump and delicious. In the spring, when they wake up from hibernation and start chowing down again, they're less rich and full, but they're still really lovely and fresh tasting. It's when the water warms in those R-less months that oyster quality can really drop off because they spawn. When this happens, oysters give up a big chunk of their body as either sperm or eggs, which depletes them of their energy reserves. Jacobson describes late summer oysters as translucent bags of seawater. Now in the past, when I was called a translucent bag of seawater, I gotta admit, it stung quite a bit. But oysters, they don't mind. Marine biologists essentially removed the seasonality factor for oysters in the 1990s when they bred something called the triploid. A triploid is an oyster with 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2, and they don't spawn. Rusty Grice from the Auburn University Shellfish Lab, which sounds like a pretty delicious lab to me, describes them as seedless watermelons. In warmer climates like the Gulf and West Coast, triploids are really popular with farmers because they get better and keep growing as opposed to spawning and deflating. Pretty cool. Okay, so now we know a bit more about oysters. We know we love eating them at restaurants, but you know what? Eating oysters at home isn't just fun, delicious, and a really great way to celebrate, it can actually be really approachable. Trust me, even if you don't like raw oysters. Like all good things in the kitchen, it starts with shopping. Buying oysters online is a great way to go because they go directly from the farmer to your door. Online, you'll usually need to order a certain quantity, usually 30 or more. But that just means you have a great excuse to have friends over to eat oysters. Now, if you're looking for fewer and you've got a good market near you, that's your next best bet. Oysters that are fresh and alive are full of water and they have a certain density to them. A good fishmonger will check for that density by knocking 2 oysters together cup to cup just like this. If an oyster is dried out, it will sound hollow instead of full and they won't sell it to you. Once you've acquired your oysters, you need to store them properly. Stored nice and cold, fresh oysters actually last a lot longer than most folks think. Depending on the variety and freshness, some can keep up to a week under refrigeration. Note that as oysters are kept alive out of water, they progressively start to taste less like the sea and more of their own oysteriness, which is definitely probably a word. In the fridge, keep them in a bowl covered with a damp towel. You may be tempted to keep your oysters on ice, but there's actually real risk in doing so. Oysters will die if they sit in fresh water, which accumulates quickly when ice melts in the fridge. If you have a perfect drainage system in place, it's doable, but your best bet is to save the ice for serving time. Speaking of serving time, I'm ready to eat some oysters. Let's go to the kitchen. The first step is to scrub your oysters to remove any sand, dirt, or anything else that's clinging to the shells. A stiff vegetable brush does a great job of this, as does a new clean sponge. Pay particular attention to the back hinge where we will eventually be putting our oyster knife and the underside of the lip where we're eventually gonna put our lips. Now, the fastest way to open an oyster is what is called the seagull technique. So you simply grab an oyster in your mouth, you fly about 50 feet up and you drop it onto the rocks below. The impact will smash open the shell for easy eating. Now, the key here is that you need to fly down before anybody else gets your oyster. If you aren't much of a flyer, which I totally understand, it's stressful, the seats are too small, it doesn't have that glamour that it used to have, all that recycled air, oof. Here's your next best bet. First up, you definitely need an oyster knife. Don't try to sub in a dinner knife or anything sharp here, which can be really dangerous. Oyster knives feature thick steel blades that are dull on the sides, but come to a point so you can wedge into the hinge. The second piece of equipment, which is just as important, is a kitchen towel. Start by folding the towel up like this into a tight roll. Then fold it over your thumb like this and grab the oyster hinge out. This setup helps brace the oyster against the counter so it doesn't slip. More importantly, the towel that loops over your thumb ensures that you don't stab yourself if you slip. See? Not stabbing myself. Now we locate the hinge and wiggle the knife in. The goal here is to wiggle in with just enough pressure until the knife is far enough in to get some purchase. It's really easy to push too hard and risk slipping, so go slow. Once you're in, twist your wrist. Now this is the real opening move. That twist will pop the oyster's hold. Once that happens, pull out the knife and give the tip a wipe on the towel. This ensures that any dirt that was in the hinge doesn't get spread onto the oyster during the next steps. Work the knife into the oyster and around with more wrist twisting. At this point, I really like to pick up the oyster as I no longer need to brace it against the counter. Then slide the blade part of the knife along the top of the shell to cut the adductor's connection to it, just like this. It's key to scrape as close as you can to the top of the shell so that all of the oyster remains in the bottom shell and you get to eat it. Now we can ditch the top shell. Next, we'll sever the adductor muscle on the bottom using the side of the tip of the knife. Finally, I put the knife down and use my fingertip to push off any bits of shell or dirt, which aren't all that fun to eat. Now, if you are a super fast shucker, which I am not, you can shuck and place directly on your beautiful bed of crushed ice. But for slow guys like us, that is not a great idea. By the time you get the last oyster shucked, you'll likely have a lot of melted ice to deal with. Your better bet is to make a foil landing zone like this. Just crumple up a sheet so that there are hills and valleys. Then place each oyster on the foil and press it so it stays flat and full of liquid. Once you've shucked all of your oysters like this, filled your chilled serving vessel with crushed ice like this, and transfer them over like this, it is time to serve. When it comes to eating oysters, I'm mostly a purist, and I really like eating them naked with maybe a sip of wine on the side for some lovely acidity. But there are so many great ways to garnish your diploids and triploids. Cooks Illustrated senior editor Lon Lamb's recipe for mignonette granita might just be the coolest. Freeze red wine vinegar, water, shallot, and sugar in a shallow bowl until it looks like this. Then use a fork to scrape it into fluffy ice crystals like this. A little freshly ground black pepper finishes it off. For something completely different but equally tasty, try her soy and lime marinated scallions. Yum. Now, I mentioned that I'm an oyster purist, but I know there are a ton of different ways to garnish oysters, and I'd love to know how you like to top yours. Raw oysters are one of life's greatest joys, but you know what? Roasted oysters are equally awesome. And with Lon's game-changing recipe, all that shucking becomes way easier. Let's get Lon in here to show us how to do it. We'll just nestle our beautiful, well-scrubbed oysters on a crumpled foiled nest on a rimmed baking sheet. Then these unshucked beauties go straight into a 450-degree oven until they open slightly, which takes just 5 minutes. This brief stay in the oven does much of the shucking work for us, making it super easy to slide our oyster knife in and shuck them using the method we did before. Lon makes everything look easy, but this really is. Then we just pop the oysters back on their foil nest, dollop with mustard butter, and go back into the oven until the oysters are beautifully plumped and register 160 degrees. Just look at these. We'll hit them with a little parsley and some lemon. Now, the next key step is to open some wine, or multiple kinds of wine. The step after that is to stare in awe at our gorgeous platters of raw and roasted oysters. We'll marvel at our tiny, creamy Kumamotos, gaze lovingly at these big, briny Easterns, share a joke with these perfectly shucked Pacifics, have an intense staring contest with our massive, intensely flavored European flats. And we'll lose that staring contest because, frankly, European flats always win. And finally, grab an oyster, top with some granita, and raise a glass, because this is absolutely how to eat oysters. Thank you all so much for watching my episode about my favorite food. Now, if you find the world of oysters and their flavors a little bit dizzying and confusing, I highly recommend checking out Rowan Jacobson's website and his amazing guide to oysters, where he'll tell you what kind of oyster eater you are. It's brilliant. There's a link below this video to check it out. While you're down there, hit that subscribe and like button. Oh, and before we go, if you try out that seagull method, let me know how it goes. See you next time.